Hello and welcome back to Camera Basics, the series where I go through the basics of camera operation while out in the real world taking example photos showing you the different settings and how they affect your image. This week we're going to be talking about getting your camera out of auto mode and switching into manual, which I believe is essential to improve your photography. And landscapes really are the perfect place to try this because you've got plenty of time, the landscape's not going anywhere, you can really take your time, try out different settings and get that photo perfect. Unlike maybe wildlife or sports, where if you miss that shot, you might not get another chance, or possibly years to come, or maybe even ever, the landscape will still be there while you figure it all out. If it isn't, then I guess you're in an earthquake or maybe a big storm, in which case you've probably got bigger things to worry about than your ISO and your aperture. So let's get straight to it. Let's take some shots of the beautiful Fairfield Church behind me. Hopefully sunset will be nice and we'll get some shots in the bag and go through all the settings you need to get your camera into manual mode and where to start. Now my camera was last used to take some photos of a friend's dog, so the settings are completely wrong for landscape photography. But this could very well represent where your camera is at the moment. So let's fix that and get it set up with some basic manual settings for landscapes. Okay, now I've got my camera set up just with my phone up here to record my screen so you can see exactly what I'm doing and the settings I'm changing. First thing we're going to do is set the ISO down to its base ISO, which on my camera is ISO 100. So I'm just going to set that down to ISO 100. And as you can see, that's made the image quite a lot darker. Now your camera might have a lower base ISO, it depends on the model of camera you've got. Some of them go to ISO 64 or ISO 50, but you want to set that to your camera's base ISO. That will give you the best possible picture quality. You'll get less noise in the image and you'll also get the most dynamic range out of your camera. So today that's particularly relevant because obviously we've got the really bright sun over there, dark church over there, and we want to get the most dynamic range that we possibly can, the difference between the highlights and the dark shadows in our image. By telling it to your ISO is 100, you're basically telling it that you've got perfect conditions, you can get enough light into that camera in other ways by, opening the aperture up or making a longer shutter speed. So unless it's really windy and you've got things moving, maybe trees, leaves, branches, that sort of thing, and you need the faster shutter speed, 99% of my shots are taken at ISO 100. So I generally leave it at that. Well, let me just walk you through the first composition that we've got going on here. We're going to use these sorts of streams that we've got going on. They fork off quite nicely. So we'll have one to the left of the shot, one to the right, and then we're going to have the fantastic old church bang in the center, and we'll hopefully get the sunset behind it. Just got to wait and see and hope sunset's good now. Okay, so while ISO is, I believe, the easiest setting, it's pretty much set and forget, set it at the base ISO and leave it there. You do have a bit more to play around with the other two settings, which are your aperture and your shutter speed. Now I've done a full video on aperture and shutter speed, which I'll leave at the top right. So if you want to learn a bit more, go and check that one out. But for now, let's set the aperture down to a good starting point, which I generally find to be f8 to f11, something like that. So let's go and change that to f8. And as you can see, the image is now a lot darker because we've basically closed that lens off, so we're letting a lot less light into the camera. So we're obviously going to have to compensate that with our shutter speed. But the reward for doing that is we get much more in focus. So we'll have a greater depth of field. We'll get more in focus from the front that we're focusing on to the back of the shot. So for this church, we obviously want to get the whole of the church in focus, along with some of these sort of bridges and probably a little bit of these sort of streams that we've got going on as well. But it is something you can play around with because you might, for example, want these reeds that are in the foreground out of focus, which, it might be something you want as an artistic decision. In which case, maybe widening that aperture up to be, say, sort of f5.6, maybe something like that, just to make the foreground a bit more blurry, might be what you want. Equally, if you've got a lot to get in focus, then you might want to close that aperture down even further to maybe f16. That's generally about as far as I recommend going. Any further than that, you get something called diffraction, which will start reducing your image quality. But certainly up to f16, and that could also give you a longer shutter speed without using filters. So that's another reason you might want to close that aperture down. But for now, let's stick with the basics. Let's stay to f8, f8 to f11, and we'll take a few shots. I'm going to switch lenses just to get a wider angle of this and get a nicer picture of the church. And I think that will improve things as well. But if I take that shot, you can see that we're still far too dark. We definitely need to increase that shutter speed. But what we're now going to do is lighten that image up. And the way we're going to do that is by increasing our shutter speed. Increasing, let's say leaving the shutter open for much longer than it is at the moment. At the moment, we're set to an 8,000th of a second, which is nowhere near light enough for this shot. So let's adjust that down. And the way we're going to tell when we've got that about right is by using the histogram. This camera has a live view histogram, and what you want to make sure as a rough guide is that you're not cutting off either side, so either right or left. Now, we're not going to be able to do that today in a single shot because it is way too light. You know, that sun is way too bright and the church is way too dark to capture this whole dynamic range in a single photo. So what we'll have to do is do a few shots at different shutter speeds and then merge them all together in exposure bracket, merge them in post. But for now, to get the church and the sort of foreground at about the right sort of exposure level, we're looking at 125th of a second. So let's take that shot. Well, what a fantastic place this is. I have of course been here before. I went inside and actually explored the church a little bit, as well as taking some sunset shots. I'll leave a link to that at the top right if you want to go and check it out. But for now, this is absolutely fantastic. There's no one here, surrounded by sheep. There's a photographer earlier, he's disappeared. So I've got the whole place to myself. What a wonderful place to be. It's absolutely fantastic here. All right, so you could very well say, well, why not just use one of the priority modes that your camera has, like aperture priority, shutter priority. If all you want to do is adjust the aperture, then great. But at some point, you will probably find yourself in landscapes needing to adjust more than just the one setting, be it shutter speed or aperture or ISO. So it's very good to know how your manual works and how everything interacts. It's called the exposure triangle. And you need to know, adjusting the aperture, how that changes the amount of light coming into the camera, and how you can then balance that by using the ISO or the shutter speed to adjust and get the image that you want. And the reason you might want to do that is, here you might want to set your aperture to f8, so you get the whole church in focus, which is a completely reasonable thing to do. But then you might also want to adjust the shutter speed, because you could have a longer shutter speed, which would smooth out all of this water that we've got going on, which I think looks quite nice. Or you might want a faster shutter speed, so you can really freeze these reeds, which are blur if you have a longer shutter, because they're moving about in the wind. The decision is yours at the end of the day as to how you want your photo to look, or, you can take several photos and merge them afterwards. But you, for that, need to adjust your aperture, making sure that's at f8. You need to make sure your ISO is at the base ISO because of the dynamic range that we've got going on. And you need to then adjust your shutter speed to get the creative vision that you want for that photo. So it's no good just being in one of the priority modes. You kind of need everything at this site. But what a wonderful place it is. Okay, so for the second composition, we're going quite wide. We're at about 22 mil or so at the moment. And we've got this bridge on the very left of the shot, which sort of draws your eye in from the left-hand side of the frame and lines your eye up nicely with the church, which then has that sun setting directly behind it. Absolutely wonderful. And we're going from everything from a 500th of a second to get the exposure correct on the sun, and to get the exposure correct on the church, we are at about a 25th of a second, 25th or so. Everything else will stay the same. We're still at f8, still at ISO 100. Let's take those shots, we'll merge them all together afterwards, and we'll hopefully get something quite nice. Now, this new composition brings me on to one of the reasons why manual mode is so important, and that's because you might want to get a sunstar. And that's where you have those lovely rays coming out of the sun when it's behind an object. In our case, this church, could be a tree, anything you like really, but they work better at a much smaller aperture, higher f-stop. So we've gone down to f16 and we've got the sun directly behind our church, and it's giving me a nice sunstar in front of it. So that is another reason you might want to use manual mode. Gives you full control, aperture, and of course we still need to adjust our shutter speed to get the 3 exposures so that we can exposure bracket and get everything as a nice HDR merge when we come to post. Okay, well the sun is really starting to set quite quickly now, so I think I'm just going to grab the camera, run over there, try a few different shots out, see if there's any better compositions over that way. I think the best shot is where we started, so let's head back there. Now the sun's moved round, I think it's going to line up with that river on the right, and hopefully it'll be a nice shot. Let's go. So how do you know what sort of aperture you need? f8 is a good starting point. That gives you a fair amount in focus. But how do you actually work out what you want your aperture to be? Well, for me, I just like to experiment. You know, take the shot, see what's in focus. Over time, you'll get to know, you'll arrive at a scene and you'll think, yeah, this will work really well at a wide aperture because we want, you know, a shallow depth of field to get the background blurred, generally in woodlands. Or you'll arrive and you think, we want everything in focus here, let's go f8, f11, something like that. So over time, you'll get to know. But if you do want to calculate it, you can use an app, of course. The one I use is called Photo Pills. I'll put this on the screen now so you can see what I'm doing. Basically, you go into your depth of field calculator. You select the focal length you have, which for us is about 22 millimeters or so. You then select your aperture, which for us is f8. And you then select the distance to your subject. So for us, well, I'm going to say that's probably about 50 meters, something like that. 50 meters, and that's the point that you're focusing on. So if you're focusing for us on this church, that's 50 meters away. And this will then show you, when you've put all your settings in, what your focal points will be. So you can see on here, we've got our subject, which is about 50 meters away, or this says 48 meters. We've got our near focus being 1.94 meters, which is going to mean those reeds in the foreground are going to just about be sharp. Some of the ones that are closer to the camera might be a bit out of focus. I don't really mind that. If I did want them in focus, we could stop down a bit more, say f11. In fact, if we put this down to f11, then you can see our near focus, still focusing on the church, but our nearest point is going to be 1.39 meters, and I reckon that'll probably get all of those reeds in focus. We've then got the distance between our church and our distance that will be in focus, which for us is pretty much to infinity. So that's how you calculate it. Use it if you'd like. Personally, I like to experiment, and I think you'll just generally build up a feel for what's right, what works. I rarely use this. Oh man, it's always such a rush at sunset. Love it, but it's all go all of a sudden. Look at that, that is just wonderful. And now that sun's gone down, dynamic range, far less of an issue. You know, we've got everything from about a 20th of a second up to a 40th of a second. So, you know, you don't always need to adjust all of the settings all of the time. We're still at f8, we're still at ISO 100. All we've done really is change the focal length and our shutter speed on this one. So, you know, for that you could use shutter priority if you want, but I still think it's really, really important to know how your manual mode works to get the best from your images and the best out of your camera at the end of the day. Now, of course, these are just generic examples that work with the location we've got today, the conditions we've got, and everything in between. You're always going to have to change these, and that will normally happen when you're around things that are moving, because if you've got trees moving and you want to freeze them, then you might need to increase your ISO, or, you know, you'll definitely need to increase your shutter speed. If you've got water and you want to get that nice ethereal look, really smooth it out, then again, you're going to want to go for a longer shutter speed, which might mean closing down your aperture, or again, putting your ISO down below the base ISO potentially, just to try and eke out as much as you can, or ideally getting filters. Done a video on filters, it's up there. But these settings give you a good starting point. So if you've never used manual mode before, set your camera up, similar to how I've done today, with that f-stop, the ISO, and then adjust your shutter speed to get the exposure right. So that does bring on to the final tip, which is don't be afraid to change them. You can always reset them, you can always watch this video again, go through it, start from scratch. You know, that camera at the start of this video was set up in completely the wrong way for landscapes. You probably never use those settings that we had at the start of this video for a landscape shot. So you can always change them back, you can always adjust things as needed. Stunning, absolutely stunning. Well, I had to move away from the little stream over there because I was getting absolutely bitten to pieces by the mosquitoes. But thank you so much for watching. I really hope it's helped you out. Hopefully it'll give you some starting points on how to get manual mode set up on your camera and get out of auto mode and really start to improve your images. If it has, give this video a quick like so that YouTube shows it to more people. Hopefully it'll help them as well. Maybe consider subscribing for some other content. Maybe give this one a watch, which is where I came here about a year or so ago and got some more sunset shots at this same location. Thanks for watching, I'll see you soon. Last hour, haven't seen a single person. Just had the sheep for company. Brilliant.